Yep, it's been a minute since I've been here. In this video, I want to lend a little bit of insight into the artist's struggle. I want to offer some hope, as well as tangible methods to maybe right your ship, so to speak. This video is for photographers and filmmakers who are up and coming, but also maybe for experienced photographers and filmmakers who might be struggling. Or maybe you're at a crossroads and you're maybe looking into the future and you're thinking, oh man, like what is this that's coming down the pipe? There's a sense of uneasiness around what you're seeing maybe and the way technology is coming in and the rate of change and all these sorts of changes in the industry. For sure, many times I've encountered photographers or filmmakers who are struggling to make it. And some of that can be chalked up to their own volition, and some can be blamed on other factors. I'm keenly aware of this because as a freelancer, I too have had my struggles in the image making field, but I've also found success in different areas. At one point, I had the opportunity to be an instructor at a photography school, and I would hear students' concerns over the years, as well as I would commiserate with my colleagues on the changing landscape of the industry. Heraclitus once noted, "The only thing that is constant is change." And I would say this is very true in the field of image making. This is not a field where you punch a clock and you sit at a desk and it's the same tasks day in and day out. No way. In fact, a primary facet of this industry is that every day is completely different from another. Thus, we have to be incredibly adaptable, right, to these changing conditions all the time. It can manifest itself in different ways, like changing production schedules, travel delays, gear misfiring, talent not showing up, the weather changing, maybe a check not showing up in a timely manner, or not getting any gigs at all. I have found that a lot of the advice that people look for in these situations is sort of the tell me to do this and it'll result in that. But the reality is everybody's got their own bag to carry. Maybe you have got kids, or maybe you've got a house, or maybe you have pets, or maybe you have gear, maybe you don't have any gear, maybe you have lots of experience, or maybe you have no experience. Everybody's path is totally different in this world. What worked for me may not work for another person. We are different personalities, different levels of get up and go, which will result in different doors opening up for me than for you, and vice versa. So it's important, I think, when you reach these crossroads, instead of looking at specific do this to get to that advice, instead looked at like more of a zoomed out view and kind of assess your path and your situation to determine what's going to be best. And that may actually be like, what are you going to try next? So how does one do this? I'm going to provide the formula that I use to assess if something is worth pursuing, how to know when to abandon ship and pivot. Changing seas require a sailor to constantly be altering their tack to stay on course. The same could be said for professionals in this image making field. We are having to ebb and flow to an unending series of challenges that force us to adapt. So one of the really common things I would run into as an instructor is that I was coming from the point of view of a photographer who had built his career in a city. I started my career in San Francisco over a couple decades ago. Frequently, I would advise my students that going to where the action is can be a smart move, especially if you're young and not tied down. Go spread your wings, gain experience, see what happens. However, the vast majority of the students that I would teach were not interested in moving to a city at all. In fact, they would tell me that freaked them out. It wasn't something that they wanted to do. They wanted to go back to their hometown and figure out how to make a living with this knowledge and this skill set. So that's totally cool. It's valid. I get that because I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire. Had a population of about 25,000 people at the time. My initial training was at a photography school nearby in Massachusetts. However, after I graduated, I would come back home to my small town and I would realize, there's no real opportunity here for me. You could say that was my first career hurdle, forcing me to adapt. And I realized that for the type of photography I wanted to do, I needed to go to a city in order to learn how things work. And in the small town that I was living in, there just weren't opportunities for commercial photographers. Despite the base level education, there were still holes that could only really be filled by gaining experience. I didn't understand the business, I didn't understand the client relations, I sure didn't know how to make an estimate and provide that. There were software programs I didn't know, and as far as executing a job and the production end of it, I really had never seen that before. So it would have been silly for me to try to take on some sort of higher end project having no experience in that. I wasn't going to get that on-set education in my hometown. It would have to come from learning from others. So I took the leap, and I jumped into a city with the dream of being a photographer. Now, my second career hurdle was very humbling because, I felt skilled in photography. I took my portfolio, the one that I shot in photography school, and I compared it to a publication called Workbook, which is a, publication where photographers at the time would advertise their work to ad agencies. And I realized immediately that my work was not even close to being able to compete. I was like looking to go from school to the big time and compete with people who had been doing this for like 20 plus years. So I took that portfolio and I put it on the shelf and I told myself that I needed to go shoot a new one that was informed by on-set training. I humbled myself. I went to pay my dues by working with these photographers and absorbing all that I could about the craft and the business. And this worked out well because I was a sponge and I was also providing a needed service, the freelance photo assistant. It was great because it was both an education and an experience rolled into one. And in my in-between times, I took every opportunity to work on new images for my portfolio, using new techniques and skills that I picked up along the way. However, things were still changing. Eventually, I needed more money. So I realized that being the assistant, while it taught me a ton, I was ready for the next step up. Okay? And at this point, I reassessed what I knew and I looked at the market needs in front of me. I was, of course, in a geographic area that was good for opportunity. And one of the opportunities that was staring at me at the time was that everyone I worked for needed someone on set to help them manage their digital files. So I began to double down with Adobe Photoshop and Capture One Pro. And I was at the forefront of the digital tech job when that came about because I knew Photoshop and C1 Pro, and a lot of these photographers who were coming over from film didn't necessarily know the software as well because it wasn't their main thing. But I spent countless evenings after assisting gigs learning online and trying to absorb like a sponge everything I could about that program, and so that I could show up on set and retouch anything that came up. And all of a sudden, they were like, oh, let's have Jeff retouch that thing out. And I was able to charge more money, and therefore I was able to more quickly build my kit and continue to work on my portfolio and kind of towards my goal of becoming the photographer, right? But it was all these little stepping stones. It wasn't like I popped out of photography school and then became an advertising photographer. It was more like I popped out of school and there was no way my work could even compete, and I had to adapt to what the market was needing while still working towards my goals. And eventually I was landing the great photography gigs. But then another big change came along. After a long time in San Francisco, I had family obligations, so I decided to move back to a rural town. And immediately I was like, oh yeah, if I'm gonna be moving here, things are gonna be different because, everything I'm doing in the city is not something that's happening here in this small town. And I quickly realized ahead of time that I was going to have to adapt to this new, very different market area. While there was some small bits of photo work here and there, these gigs were like 10 times less money than what I was getting in the urban environment. And things like usage were just kind of like, usage, what's usage? What does that mean? Wait, what do you mean I don't own the image? So I was like dealing with that kind of stuff, right? I was going to have to sort of revisit my skill set and reassess what I was doing, where I was going, and what I really wanted out of this small market. So you see, all the adaptations have a foundation to them. And that foundation is that if your back is against the wall, you may have to start with some level of education. In all my examples, I've tired of my day job, so I went to a photography school, got a good foundation, but not quite ready. So I apprenticeshiped, like the assistant thing, which is really the best education. And then when it ran its course, I learned new software to offer that, and then eventually got to a spot I was dreaming about, but then I had to pivot again to a small market, which meant learning a whole new bag of tricks. So education is really your touchstone for each new major hurdle or pivot you may encounter. From there, you need to assess your skills and need to say, okay, of these skills that I've learned, which one of these are really in need? Does anybody here need what I do? And you have to look at maybe, what the other people who are working in that field, figure out what they're bringing to the table. And are they a specialist? Are they a generalist? How often do I think they're working? What am I going to need to do? What investment of my time and energy and maybe money am I going to need in order to do what it is they're doing? If most of the competition in an area all has great work and it seems like they're all struggling, maybe there's just not enough to go around. And it's this sort of assessment of your skills, it has to be done through the lens of your geographic area. Does your market area need what you do? If you have the foundation and you have the skills for the job and the area you're in has opportunity, that's when you can jump in and go for it and gain experience. And when you begin to accumulate these experiences, you can start to use programs like Excel or QuickBooks to track your specific activities and see which ones are really bringing in the most money. That's generally how it worked for me. However, the elephant in the room for this generation is that there is some new technology coming down the pipe that threatens the very skills we have fought to acquire. These things that we try to implement in our work, but it's not an anomaly. Technology has a long history of threatening the livelihoods of craftspeople. I remember right around 2000, 2002, somewhere around there was a lot of film photographers, and they had invested thousands of dollars into their film setups to be able to, efficiently and effectively photograph these big campaigns. Whether it was like 35 or medium format or 4x5 or 8x10, some were 8x10 systems, all of a sudden you have digital cameras appearing, and they were expensive. And I think like maybe just a few megapixels. And it freaked some photographers out because it was like sort of this, harbinger for what was to come. After all, these cameras absolutely did remove the job of scanner technician and eventually closed film labs down. I distinctively remember working with one photographer who saw this coming, and he had been shooting film for decades. He had made tons of money, and he just straight up retired. He was like, I'm out. Others were more mid-level in their career and realized, I can't just get out. I'm going to have to adapt. I'm going to have to pivot into this and make the changes I need to make, invest in what I need to invest in. And some of them invested in these really expensive digital backs. Some waited a little longer, and they thought the 35 systems at the time were going to be good enough for their style of shooting. And, overall, many jumped in. And their investment was not solely a new camera system. To many who bowed out, I think the daunting part may have really been the learning curve to adopting a full digital workflow. It meant starting over with education, assessing their skills, retraining, practicing, getting experiences, tracking that work over time to stay competitive. And this all has to do with change, because change is hard. I mean, we can look back to the Industrial Revolution to see some of that, right? The Luddites, for example. I looked up the Luddites the other day on Wikipedia, and it says here, the Luddites feared that the time spent learning the skills of their craft would go to waste, as machines would replace their role in the industry. Sound familiar? Kind of like what's happening now with AI and all that's coming in. We don't really know. It's these new technologies that are starting to pop in. And a friend of mine said to me the other day, a really great quote. He said, change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. It's actually a Tony Robbins quote, according to the internet, but I thought it was a good one for this topic. Because when I look back at my own career in that time period when some photographers were leaving the industry because of digital and other photographers were embracing it, and at that time, I was kind of stuck in the middle, and I was like, well, I'm going to embrace the post-production end so that I can be of use to the people that I'm working with and be part of this whole thing. I decided to lean into it, and that was a total game changer for my career. It led to a lot of really lucrative opportunities and really rewarding experiences. I wouldn't really trade any of that. I've come to realize that I've had to pivot and adapt a number of times in my career, and you very likely also have to adapt a lot too. It's kind of a feature after all of the work we do. One of the great things over time, as you take on different jobs, you might realize that you're doing different tasks. For example, for a long time, I would do Photoshop retouching. I was doing still photography, and I was taking on video projects, and then I was just doing audio only and taking on video editing. And I even have done some writing and been published. And so I'd track all these different activities in a program like QuickBooks. And I would basically be able to run a report that shows me where my income is coming from each of these activities. And year to year, I could look and I could say, well, which one is growing and which one is falling off? And the ones that were going up, I would double down on. And the ones that were falling off, I would just let go. In your career, as you face hurdles and you question maybe if you should hang it up, maybe instead you need to reevaluate some of these things, such as, is your geographic location conducive to the work you want to do? Are your skills up to snuff to compete with the others doing what you want to do? Maybe do you need to bolster your knowledge with education? Or if you feel like you have the basic level of education in the field, do you just need hands-on experience? Are you willing to adapt to attain what you want? And if things change in your life, are you willing to reevaluate it all again and do what you need to do to pivot to the next interesting thing? See, it's been my direct experience that when faced with a pivotal moment, I seek the education and I assess my geographic market. Will it fly here? Okay. I double down on the very specific skills that will open up opportunities for me. I pursue the work to gain experience, and then I track those activities, right, to examine if they are working or not. If not, I might course correct a bit and try again. Because once you get to the gain experience phase and it starts to take off, those experiences are like snowball effect. They just keep getting better and bigger, more interesting, and your skills develop, you become confident, you start to become maybe prideful about what you're doing because, well, it's starting to work. And you can track it all with hard data about how often you're doing it and how much money it's bringing in. And the things that are working, double down on them, and the things that aren't working, let them go. For me, my career has not been made from stubbornly trying to fit the square peg into the round hole, but rather it's been successful mostly because of my willingness to adapt and try new things. So if you like this video, hit that like button. If you'd like to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button. And feel free to comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. See you again.